Hey, it's Chris, Liege of Games. So, if you're wondering about Tidal Blades 2 Rise of the Unfolders, let's talk. I'm going to give you 5 big things, my full impressions of everything that you need to know on figuring out this game, and to help you figure out whether or not it's right for you and whether or not you should be backing it on crowdfunding. So, let's talk. Let's get right into this. No preamble. Let's go. So, just basic overview. Rise of the Unfolders, Tidal Blades 2, as more of a dungeon crawl. And if you're looking at this, you're obviously driven by your need for that. The question I always ask myself when I'm looking at games like this is, why would I look at a game like this over something else that's either in my collection already or that is out there in the market in the first place? Point number one, and I'll say this because it matters. The biggest comparison, I don't know what other people are going to say, the biggest comparison that I will make is point blank, it is very akin to Gloomhaven Jaws of the Lion. There is huge influences. You can see the tendrils of creep stranding from Jaws of the Lion straight down into this. And I say that not as a negative, I say that as a positive. Not only with the storybook, with the multi-part scenarios, but I also say it with the map books, where you're literally flipping them open and getting hex-based systems so that you're matching them up. And the maps fold open. So on the first map, it may be completely blank. On the second map, you may have hexes now that you have explored into that area and the dangers or the tribulations are unfolded towards you. And it is very akin to Jaws of the Lion in that way, but also in the sense of how it lays itself out, sort of prompting you in said storybook in the first place. There is a bit of overhead, but comparatively to the other games that I have played recently, but are also in my collection, when you're looking at things like just ones that are sitting around me in my collection, for example, Machina Arcana, Bloodborne, the one that's going up head to head, Earth Under Siege Flashpoint, all of these similar-esque crawls. This one, Vagrant Song, even as the other more recent one, this one has a little bit less overhead. It's more like Vagrant Song in terms of the amount of overhead that you need to know. There's enough, but there's not an overwhelming amount, sort of akin to, again, Jaws of the Lion. And it walks you through step by step. Okay, well, here's your little text-based scenario. Here's your little map. Put out your people here. Here is the objective. Here's what the new stuff means as you're going along. And it handholds, but not too much either. Now, again, I've been told that the difficulty is still being, worked out. Because I played this with a 2-player situation. And it scales everywhere on this map. You'll see the 3s and the 4s. And it scales that way depending on how many players are going against it. And again, I think it scales relatively well, but I think, and we'll talk about this, there are certain aspects right now, again, that the difficulty needs to be tweaked on. As for example, I thought some of the scenarios themselves, non-boss, were a little bit easier at the lower player counts. I thought the boss battle would have been much easier at a higher player count, though. Those are going to be things that are tweaked pre-production that I don't really worry about too much right now. But just to know that you can play with any number of other players, and that, unlike a lot of the other games that I mentioned there, that this scales 1 to 4 players. A lot of the other dungeon crawls, even my favorite dungeon crawl, Madara, it doesn't scale. Adventure Tactics, I want to get that played with my kids, but only one of my kids is old enough, so it doesn't scale. You need 3 players. And so being able to play this with scenarios that walk you through it, that you can sit down and play 2 in an hour and a half, that's what it is pretty easy, especially if you're just 1 player. You could easily get through it with more players in about the same time. And so that's also what I mean that it does well in the scaling aspect. Now, on some of these parts, you'll see, okay, well, here's chapter 3, for example. Chapter 3, we set up, we do it, 3.1, 3.2, 3.3. So there are elements of the scenario. It's not just sort of a, here's everything. Again, just like the Jaws of the Lion lays out for you. It changes it up on the fly of what you're having to do. And, just of the 6 scenarios that are in this storybook, they are varied enough, without going into too much spoilerage, that I felt like I was doing something different. I mean, for example, the boss battle. The boss battle, you don't even realize you're going to be going into a boss battle when you're doing it. All you realize is that you're trying to rescue an NPC, but at the end of every round, his health goes down. But you have the ability to heal him, but you have to go and grab the fruit, and then you have to bring the fruit to him. And there's only so many fruit on the board, and the fruit are well spaced out. Oh, and then in the third part of the scenario, or the second part of the scenario ish, it expands to the boss, and you have to not only defeat the boss in the time frame, but you also have to keep him alive, because if you can't do either, then you lose. And your characters are fragile. They are not uber powerful. We'll talk about that in a minute. And so it takes a different, rather than slug them out, approach to a lot of other dungeon crawlers from that aspect. The other nice thing that it does well is, after the scenario, again, as a cooperative game, you sometimes worry, you're going to be killing guys, you're going to be knocking out enemies, you're going to be getting little rewards, trinkets, items, fame, experience for doing so. And the fame and the experience are going to help you unlock things as you're going along. The one thing I always worry about, I worry about uneven distributions of rewards, right? That can be a definite issue when you have this sort of mechanism within a game, but it just basically says, okay, if you have this done in this objective, in this mission or this scenario, everybody gets this amount of experience, this amount of fame. If you do it in this number of rounds, you're going to get this much. If you save this many citizens, you're going to get this much. If you don't, well, you're going to get slightly less, slightly less, slightly less. Which works well, because no one is then feeling left out or scorned, if you will, in a cooperative game. The other nice thing is it's self-contained. I mean, you worry about some of these boss battling. I mean, that's really where the boss battling is trouble, right? Is all of the scenarios, you are contained within 12 rounds. So if you just don't do it in 12 rounds, there is a sense of urgency there. And you have to be very careful of the objectives. The second mission I looked at, and it's just basically get from point A to point B to point C. And I said, screw it. I'm flat out sprinting with my guys and teleporting with Echo to get to my sprinter who's at the end. And it worked beautifully. But if you don't realize, again, what is your objective because you're time limited, you just need to be aware. And do you like that? Or do you prefer more of an open world, a free frame situation where there is no time crunch, no pressure? Because that can also be it. Again, it's a time crunch akin to Jaws of the Lion in the sense that you're just going to run out of cards, you run out of life, run out of ability to play. No, this is going to be timed rounds, which means it's also self-contained in a time frame on the table, which is also nice. The other thing, point 2, that it does well, hinging right off of point 1, is that the campaign style, like, I didn't feel like I had to play all of these right in a row. I did play them all almost right in a row over 2 days, but I didn't need to. And this is going to sound weird. In the technology-driven component world that we are in the sophistication of bookmarking and doing everything along those lines, you know what I've got here in front of me? I've got 2 little paper foldouts that track my characters, Axel and Echo, and it has everything on there that you need to do. And then you know what? I just filled it in with a pencil. You can see little marks down here on the wound track. You can see some of the experience that I filled in up here, but it's just all right here. It's easy, and it's cool because it utilizes a mechanism that I think is vastly underrated. The Zombie Kids evolution, play enough times, get enough experience, fill in enough bubbles, unlock stuff. And I love unlocking things this way. Rewards you. And again, you have 2 different paths that you're going off. So for Axel, it's the show-off path or the team player path, because each character, as you're going through these scenarios, gets a new random objective that has 2, if you don't want to think path of light and shadows, where you can either go the path of light or the path of shadows, and really emphasizing if you go 1, you're going to get big bonuses. Well, that's what this does with each of your goals in a mission, which again gives you an additional layer to the missions themselves. Because they're not impossible, they're going to play to their strengths, but just how you want to play to their strengths works. And that's what it does really well. Now, I'll argue that one of the weaker points on that is I felt like some of the cards were not different enough. Some of the cards did not give me enough variety in what they were doing. They were a little limited. I mean, Echo he's kind of, what he looks like. He's a small fry, right? You know, I'm going to be rolling 1 and 2 dice with him, and he's not going to be pounding, you know, bad guys into oblivion. And so one of his objectives was, you know, do 7 damage once in a round. I went with the other one. So it's a little, and even the cards themselves that you put into your deck that you're getting are, again, it sort of reminded me a little bit, and I say this as one of my favorite games. It reminded me more of Marvel United in the sense that, you know, you don't have 10 different resources or things you're keeping track of, right? You've really got like 2, maybe 3-ish. The spirit, the focus, and the shields, essentially. The 3 things that you're mainly managing on the board with a little bit of nuance there, but not enough that you're going to be like, oh, geez, what am I doing? Oh, but again, this does a great job of keeping it between scenarios. I mean, because the other thing apart from this is you really just have your cards. Not much else. Which, again, that's the biggest problem with campaign-driven games is the carryover from game to game, the sorting through, the mixing, the matching, the KDM, the Gloomhaven, original, is just a mess often. And that's half the hassle of getting it in and out when you're not playing multiple scenarios in a row, of dealing with that. And this does a great job of that. Point 3, and this is either going to turn on or turn off people, and it's just something that you need to remember and be more aware of yourself on, and that's dice. You're going to be rolling dice in this game, and dice are just not always going to go for you when you're trying to hit the enemy in order to defeat them. The enemy just hits you, and so you have to be able to mitigate it. There's no dice rolling for the enemy except for a small part, because then it can kind of add or have a special effect. But for all intents and purposes, you need to be more strategic, because it's I roll to hit you and they don't roll to hit me. So how are you going to mitigate that in the turns that you're doing? But that's a big one, because it is contrary to the main focus of the comparisons here of Jaws of the Lion, because it's just dice versus no dice. Where do you fall on that line? Personally, I have no problem with dice. Dice hate me, I love them. It's a symbiotic, maybe mutual relationship there. Point 4, going back to those cards. This board that you've got, you can't see it well here. I'll show some pictures here as where I'm talking. But laying the cards in this combination, I wasn't sure what to expect. Before I laid my hands on the prototype copy, I hadn't seen what it actually looked like and what you were actually doing on a turn-by-turn basis. It works. It's new. It's different. It forces you to choose things in how you're going to do them, because you're going to potentially put down cards in rows, and you're going to get penalized when you get wounds or battle scars in terms of not being able to put in a certain spot. And you're going to want to clear spots in terms of rows when you fill them and utilize those powers so that you can get the spot underneath, because you need it again in the future, soon. And so that dictates things. We'll go back for a half second here. We're going to put point 3B after 4. I know, this is a Liege video, so bear with me. Because it ties into the dice element that, again, is an element itself objectively, but people are going to feel more subjective about it, and that is the initiative track. Are you okay with variable initiative as you're going through the rounds, with some ability to control them, with a plus, minus, or nothing in the upper left-hand corner of your cards as well as the enemy cards? Because similarly to, say, Aeon's End, but slightly different in the sense that Aeon's End, you're just shuffling them up and then just drawing. And so you really don't have any influence over what they actually are. But if you've played Aeon's End and you're aware of the influence, drastically different outcome of a round, of a scenario, of a game, based on whether or not you sometimes go before or after an enemy, or if the enemy goes twice in Aeon's End before you can get in the rest of the players. And this is similar in the sense that you have cards that are going to allow you to influence it +1, +2, -1, -2, depending on what your card is. And sometimes you just don't have the matchup of the pluses and the action itself versus where you want to be on the initiative track. And how frustrating is that going to be with you when you play something right and the enemy all of a sudden just vaunts up above you and it drastically changes? Because what you're doing when you're playing these cards, I mentioned that, you're simultaneously putting them down hidden before you know what the monster cards are. And so you flip them all up, and if you had known the monster was either going to go before you or after you potentially, you might have chosen something different. It's a little bit slight adjacent to action programming in that sense, but then you can control where it goes on the grid afterwards, which allows you to mitigate it to some degree. But again, is that going to be enough for you to feel that way? Food for thought. I personally have no problem with it. I know there were times that if the enemies hadn't gone first, I would have had a much better result. And are you okay with that when also a dice game? I mean, it's consistent in its approach in that sense, and then there is chaos, and there is some randomness, and there is not perfect strategy. And it does it well, but again, some people just don't like that. Point 5, the characters themselves. The characters themselves are similar, but they are also not significantly dissimilar, if that makes sense. If you learn one character, they're going to have their strengths, their weaknesses, their nuances. Echo is very much more of a ranged, passive person. And, Axel is much more of the melee, smash and grab, run away fast. And they're going to have their strengths and their weaknesses. But if you learn one, it's not to say that you have to relearn the whole game or learn how to play completely differently with another character, for example. If you learn one, you're going to be able to port over to another very easily. The only thing I did not see addressed, which I'm sure will be addressed, is what happens if you are jumping in and jumping out. Like if I play 2 players and then I play 4 players and then I play 3 players, what happens to the characters in between when they're not being used? Are they going to be upgraded in between? And so I don't know what's going to happen from that mechanic aspect. And to go along with the characters, there is sort of the home base operations, if you will, where you end up with this map in a certain number of days to explore and to upgrade. And so that gives you a little bit more in terms of items and abilities and just actions you can do in terms of that little hidden information thing that I showed you earlier of how you spend your experience to give it some more asymmetry than it would otherwise, while again allowing your character again to be my Axel completely different from your Axel, my Axel being not completely different, but having nuances and strengths different than your Axel, even if we play the same set of scenarios with the same outcomes each time. But again, not making it too complex that you're scratching your head trying to remember and keep up with things, because that's also sometimes an issue with these games in the first place, and it does not make me feel that way with this, or with these, or with these. So what do I think overall? This is a solid game. If you like and do not mind dice chucking, if you're looking for something lighter, and by no means is it light. My wife looked at me playing two-handed earlier this afternoon and said, that looks kind of complex. And I said, yeah, but not really. I had no trouble playing multi-handed with this. The only difficulty multi-handed was some of the enemy stuff. When I was playing against the boss, who has, a couple different, abilities that maybe affect, immediately and then at the end of the round, or immediately and then if something happens or doesn't happen, or if they roll a certain thing. But the AI system, again, works well. The asymmetry and the character building works well. It's one of those games where I would say none of the individual mechanics, except maybe bar the grid system, is going to stand out as, wow, this is completely unique. I will say at the same time, the sum of the parts is greater than the individual pieces in a good way. Sort of like the sum of the parts of Marvel United. I'm not comparing Marvel United and this game and saying that if you like one, you're going to like the other or anything like that. But just in the sense that Marvel United, for me, the sum of the parts with the expansions and the stuff that was added in there, despite the simplicity in the first place of what was taken and being used, achieved much greater than I ever would have expected. And I would say the same of this in that sense. The multi-part scenarios with the abilities and the distinctions between scenarios to be able to do what you need to do on the fly and adapt as you go in a time limited frame. There's not really a whole lot else out there like it. I would compare it probably more closely to a combination of Jaws of the Lion and Vagrant Song. Jaws of the Lion in the mechanics, in the map-based system, in the slowly giving you information as you go and not making it just, okay, go look up these 37 things that I'm not going to tell you about. No, it tells you and defines it and gives you it when you need it, as you need it, but with the ability to handle things and just work really efficiently in a time frame that is what you're looking for without having to play a 2 or 3 hour slog and try to remember all the rules, akin to Vagrant Song in the sense that that does that as well, where you can play 2 or 3 scenarios in a row, have no problem picking it up, setting it down, and going in between and just having fun. And so if you're looking for something that is going to be easier to get to the table from a dungeon crawl, because that is the big concern. When I look at the other dungeon crawls out there, you know, I look at Bard Sung, I look at Darkest Dungeon, of the ones that are like upcoming, that are sitting out there in the nebula. I look at, you know, even, we'll talk about Sanko Cushion, the other big one that I'm waiting for. You know what scares me about Sanko Cushion is that it's going to be so complex that it's going to be hard to get to the table. You know why I don't get Kingdom Death Monster to the table more? It's just because the campaign, the pickup, setup, put down is much harder. This, along with Jaws of the Lion, makes it easier to get to the table. And that cannot be discounted when you're looking at these type of games. And if you're like me, the price point is good because they're also doing a standee version versus a miniature version. One last point in here, as I'm making comparisons to Jaws of the Lion, the inevitable comparison that is going to be made, and I've already seen it being milled about, is that people are going to look at this cost and they're going to go, whatever, 75, 100, 150, whatever it's going to be, comparison to the $40 that you can go buy Jaws of the Lion for, right? That's going to be the direct comparison. And people go, well, why would I get this versus that? Well, let's talk about Jaws of the Lion. It is the exception rather than the rule. Now, let's say they're making money, but when you have a distribution in the thousands, in the tens of thousands, in the potentially even higher than that, if you know anything from the production side of things, if you've done any sort of project, if you go to any sort of website when you're ordering documents or t-shirts or anything, as you get more, the price per unit goes drastically down, especially at those very high counts. And so that is the aspect that is going to be overlooked when you're talking about Tidal Blades, which is going to be in the thousands, probably under 10,000 if I had to guess right now offhand before the campaign, versus Jaws of the Lion, which is going to be thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands, many times over of Tidal Blades. And so they can afford then to make a much smaller margin on Gloomhaven because you're selling en masse, plethora, many times over. Whereas Tidal Blades, in order to stay in business, the overhead in terms of the margin has to be higher, especially with the stuff that's going on from a distribution and shipping side of things now as a smaller, more independent company. Now, that's not to dismiss the price whatsoever, but for comparatively the other games on crowdfunding of similar size, similar ilk, if you compare apples to apples and not apples to oranges, it's going to be much closer when you're looking at the similar crowdfunding with or without standees, miniatures, along those aspects. I mean, Uprising Curse of the Last Emperor with the standees for, you know, about that price with more content maybe than even this for a slightly higher price versus, you know, something like Bard Sung, which is going to be, or Darkest Dungeon with all of that where there's more heavy plastic. Again, not directly apples to apples, but it's going to be closer to those things than it is going to be something that went straight to retail with a much, much larger distribution and numbers. You could probably fit almost everything in this size of box for the whole, what is it going to be, like 28 or 32 scenario campaign. Maybe slightly bigger. But I don't have to worry about, you know, like, I'm looking at Bloodborne behind the camera with, you know, I don't even have all the expansions, but, you know, when a Simon box comes in and it's literally like this freaking big, and you're looking at this much and it's mostly plastic with air in the boxes, I don't need to worry about that because it's that. Now, if you want to get the miniature expansion, sort of like the Awakened Realms things, I give them a lot of kudos for also splitting that apart and not content locking gameplay with plastic chunks. So there you go. Those are my thoughts on Tidal Blades 2 Rise of the Unfolders. Hopefully that's helpful. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you have comments or questions in the comment section below. I'm happy to answer them. Link to the campaign page below as well. If you made it this far, smash the like button. Thank you for watching in the first place. Hopefully this was helpful in my thoughts and impressions based on hands-on copy of Tidal Blades 2 Rise of the Unfolders. Stay classy. Thanks for watching. No end ramble. No end ramble this time. We're doing this serious.